Today is the day we go to Leyton Orient, a club for a fiver, Channel 4 documentary that aired in 1995. It was a fly-in-the-wall documentary recorded by a fan during their horrific season in 1995 under John Sitton. Lads, this is one of those documentaries that probably should have never happened in the state that Leyton Orient was in, and even just the manager that John Sitton was at that stage. It's such a bizarre story, first of all, and secondly, the footage of this is unbelievable. Ciaran, you're the one that says yes to this, so I'll give you first choice on why you thought this was worth covering.
There's 90s clubs in the lower league are just endlessly fascinating because you just are constantly beguiled by the fact that these are just completely useless businesses. Like, as a business model, you just wouldn't dream of continuing them. You wouldn't dream it up. You wouldn't be able to keep it going in any respect. Like, Orient are a particularly good example, I think, because East London, before the kind of rise and gentrification, or whatever you want to call it, it was a poor area. Orient has traditionally been a team that's never really troubled the upper echelons of the English football pyramid. And it's one that has had, and particularly in recent times, had a lot of problems with ownership. So I would guarantee that if you were in the pub with an Orient fan for any period of time, they will have stories that make your hair curl, because just through owners and coaches that they would have seen. And I think this is such a beautiful snapshot of just one period of time. And also the fact that there's no football shown. There's absolutely no footage of the games themselves. There's no understanding from the audience's point of view what's actually happening on the pitch. So it's very much this kind of Shakespearean, tragicomedy playing out in front of your very eyes. And, I'm sure we'll go on to John Sitton and Barry Hearn and everyone, but it's got some really interesting characters in there as well. So I thought it was a really good watch anyway.
So the background to the story, for those who aren't aware, is essentially the club, Leyton Orient, in the lower leagues of the English Football League. This is League 2 at this stage in 1995, the third division as it was known then. The club were losing £10,000 a week and they were facing relegation. The PFA were paying the wages and they were forced to reduce their squad to 13 players. What caused all this and what caused the name Leyton Orient, a club for a fiver, was the owner, Tony Wood, who had investments in Rwanda. And now this is where the story takes a little bit of a weird turn that I didn't expect. So Tony Wood, he owned a business in Rwanda. He was the owner of Leyton Orient, and Rwanda was in the middle of a civil war at this stage. So his business was blown up by crossfire in the civil war. A couple of staff members were killed, and he wanted to offload this club. It wasn't making any money, it was losing money, it was hemorrhaging money, and he jokingly said in an interview that if anybody offered him a fiver for the club, he'd take it because he just can't sustain the level of money that he's losing from it anymore. Colm, first of all, the first 10 minutes of this, you think it's going to be a bog standard football documentary following a Division 3 side in the English Football League, and then it takes this turn and then it just spirals out of control from there. This is a tragic comedy.
I think Ciaran encapsulated it perfectly there, and it's a really good point in that I actually think what adds to the overall documentary is that you don't see a second of the on-the-pitch action. So you're imagining, it's like the movie Psycho, like you're imagining what happens, but you never see it for yourself. It's actually better again. My favourite line in the whole documentary is the very last, and it belongs to the star of the show, John Sitton, who says, "The game has the uncanny knack of making you very cynical." And then it plays out. And it tells you what happens to Tony Wood. He goes back to Rwanda to try and save his business. He subsequently died in September 2002. And the co-manager, Chris Turner, moved on to a job at Leicester City. And subsequently, he had quite a good managerial career with Hartlepool and Sheffield Wednesday. And he's a former Manchester United player himself. And I think he was the marketing manager of Port Vale recently. Whereas John Sitton was ostracised completely from football after that documentary aired, sunk into a significant depression, which he got out of, thankfully, tried his best to get back into football, ended up becoming a taxi driver, which is what he does to this day, was a coach of some renown, coached at Lillishall coached alongside Kenny Jackett and Alan Pardew, coached Ledley King, but couldn't get into football after the airing of this documentary. And still to this day is incredibly bitter about that. And the documentary was filmed by a fan who got this exclusive access, a bit like An Impossible Job with Graham Taylor, which was just the thing to do, the fly on the wall documentary in the 90s in English football. It was the gift that kept on giving for a short period. And it was supposed to be about the football club, but it ended up being about this incredibly charismatic star of the show, this manager, who was he out of his depth? I don't know, but he was certainly too passionate and too emotional. And what subsequently transpired was some of the most watched footage in internet history when it comes to football rants. And it's an incredible documentary, and I hadn't watched it in full until last night. I'd only watched those snippets that we all seen on YouTube. Well,
one of the lines that's actually in our intro is, none of you have done anything to justify the wages that you're on, and it's encapsulates where English football was at that stage. And you're talking about a Division 3 club in a relegation battle, and some of these players were on thousands because the contracts were starting to rack up, and clubs were trying to sustain this level of growth that was completely unsustainable, really. And John Sitton, he is the star of this show, essentially. Ciaran, not a manager I would like to get on the wrong side, because some of these players are on the good side of him and they still sound like they've killed his granny.
Yeah. So the thing with Sitton is, on the one hand, I really don't like the vibe that he gives off. There's something about him where I'm just like, I don't really warm to him. But I'm really loath to write him off as a person, a coach, and certainly as a man, because, yeah, he definitely comes across as bitter. He definitely comes across as someone who has depressive tendencies, without doubt. He also comes across as someone who does care about this, and who might care maybe for his own personal reputation, but also might, cares for the football club. And I think what we do underestimate generally about managers is that they do feel themselves largely as custodians. So they will, they are aware that they are responsible for other people's jobs, particularly in a situation like this where they're hemorrhaging money. I mean, they're losing, I think, 10 grand a week at one stage. So the pressure on a manager's shoulders, particularly before the responsibilities were moved out into other areas across the people in the club, is enormous. And at a club like this, where, I mean, there's one point where obviously where the coach company won't even take the team to a match, or the youth team to a match, because they haven't paid up front. That's enormous. And Sitton is definitely a very bitter man towards the end. But they do show these little different sides to him. So there's a bit where his little son comes into the dressing room and he kind of chucks him up in the air, and he has a bit of alone time with him, and it was really nice. I mean, that's a nice little aside. But he's a complex character. He's not someone I'm sure I would have really got anything out of playing for. He doesn't seem to offer a great deal more than sort of the bluster that comes with those kind of changing room rants. But he was an interesting bloke for sure.
So one of the key points I want to touch on with John Sitton, and you mentioned it sort of there, is just the way that he relates to the footballers, talks to the footballers, and also the heavy weight of the burden of knowing this club is going under. I mean, like, John Sitton played for Leyton Orient. He knows what the club means to the fans in that way. He knows what it's like to be a player for them. But also, this is at the stage where the manager was responsible for everything. So you didn't have the layers of management when it came to a football club like you do now. He had those pressures, but he brought those pressures into the dressing room as well. And at one stage, it's after the new owners take over, before Barry Hearn, that he starts talking to the players about their contracts, saying that those lads upstairs, they want to chuck all you out of this dressing room. They want to get rid of you, so they want to fire you and take in youth players because they don't have to pay them. And that didn't really sit right with me, because you're talking about players' livelihoods. This is the level of football where you're not living in a $1 million mansion. You're living maybe in a semi-detached house if you're lucky. And this was even before where League Two you could earn that amount of money. Like, a lot of these players would have side jobs as well. So to bring that added pressure into the relegation when these players are fighting literally for their jobs already, it just doesn't sit right with me, Colm. What did you think of that?
Yeah, that's half-time in the Brentford game where they're 3-0 down. And he's referring to, that's the one he's referring to, everyone who's on 35 grand on. And then it flashes to full-time and it's 3-0, which is exactly what happens to Mike Bassett, England manager, with the 4-0 down at half-time and then 4-0 full-time. So they had to have taken it from that. And when it goes to full-time, you get the post-match discussion in the dressing room. And Sitton's much calmer. And I think he actually kind of apologises for that comment. And he starts using these adjectives to describe the ongoing crisis at the club. And then uses the word praisingly and turns to Chris Ernest, is that a word? I don't know, well, I've used it anyway. And there's another great moment where he says, I think it's towards the start of the documentary, out of 19, we've won 2, drawn 4 and lost 12. Which is a total of 18. So he's discarding one game. So there was these moments that didn't help himself at all on camera. And yeah, I agree with you that he's really not connecting with the players, with the people that he needs to perform for him. And I think it's encapsulated not in the Brentford rant and not in the most famous rant against Blackpool, Sam Allardyce's Blackpool at the time. I actually think the worst talk he gives is the only match that they win in the documentary, which is against Tiverton in the FA Cup first round. Because he claims post-match that they were no good. We take his word for it. We obviously didn't see the game. And he says, the best word I can think of to describe some of your performance is naive. But then he gets very defensive and a bit paranoid by saying, if you think you can F with me in my career, you've another thing coming. Which is, it kind of reminded me of the Diego Maradona documentary recently where he managed Dorados in Mexico and there's one game they're losing at half-time. And he talks about how Maradona himself, was effed over by the officials, and that's always been the case. And obviously this is the great Diego Maradona. But Sitton actually has a bit of that about him, where it does become about him, and he is completely paranoid against his own players, that they're out to get him here, that they're not playing for him. And I think you're essentially seeing a bit of a breakdown in someone's character as the documentary progresses. But I definitely do have a bit of sympathy for him, because outside of And You Can Bring Your Dinner, which is a reference to a movie called Colours starring Robert Duvall and Sean Penn, but he became too abstract and people didn't know what he was talking about. Outside of that, I received similar... I was in the wrong side of some of those verbal lashings in dressing rooms playing back in Cork.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you.
It's not the most outlandish thing ever.
Have you ever been in a dressing room, Ciaran? I don't know if you played football at a Saturday, Sunday league standard, but have you ever been in a dressing room where the manager has used so many expletives as John Sitton does in this movie? Because I've been at the tail end of some lashings by a manager, but never to this extent. Colm?
Oh, me, sorry. No, never to that extent, absolutely not. But it wasn't alien to me when I was watching it. Especially when you see the full documentary in context, because I had only watched the clips previously, and the clips seem outlandish, and he's a figure of fun and ridicule. But when you see the whole documentary, it does make sense. And I can think of specific managers that I played under where this is what happens to them as the season goes on when things aren't going their way. Because Sitton feels very, he feels aggrieved because he says he's working the job of 5 people and he's on a youth salary and he's basically jealous of the amount of money that his players are on. And in a different mould itself, that's what happens in Sunday League football, that a lot of coaches I played under would be completely bitter about what's transpiring out in the pitch. And Sitton himself claims that Teddy Sheringham met him a few years ago and said, you were incredibly hard done by to be ostracised from football after the airing of that documentary. Because Sheringham says, I see that stuff happening in dressing rooms all the time. And bear in mind, Sheringham had a 30-year professional career. He was like, say, John, that happens all the time. They were just out to get you. But the problem was, it was all on camera. And actually, Sitton was a lot younger than he looks as well in that documentary. He's in his mid-30s. And people wouldn't touch him afterwards because this guy was a complete loose cannon. But I've seen characters like that. This is nothing new to me. It's just that he has some incredibly memorable and now infamous catchphrases. So you're never going to forget about it.
Yeah, so John Sitton is the star of the show, but there are also different players involved in this. Obviously, a club takes more than a manager, and there requires people to come in to actually own this club. And this is where it gets really interesting, because people of a certain age everyone knows who Eddie Hearn is now, but Eddie Hearn is only the second Hearn to be the sort of wheeler-dealer, buying businesses, trying to save them. And Barry Hearn, his father, did it with darts, he did it with snooker, and he attempted to do it with football as well, and he takes over Leyton Orient. This is where it gets a bit mad, because so we were talking about the 1995, so this is the stage where the Premier League is really starting to kick off. Clubs, everybody wants to be in it because that's where the money is. And I just marked down 4 clubs that were actually in the league the same year as Leyton Orient. So you have Blackpool, Swansea, Brighton and Cardiff. All 4 of those clubs have played in the Premier League since. Leyton Orient haven't got anywhere near it. So the dream is for these owners to come in and turn these kind of clubs into a Premier League club, or get them near enough so they can get that money. And that's what Barry Hearn wanted to do, but it just wasn't possible. Like, what did you make of that sort of dream at that stage for Leyton Orient? Is that something that, was Barry Hearn the right man for the job, Colm?
Well, he stayed there for 19 years after buying it. He only sold the club in 2014. They hired a manager to replace him called Pat Holland, who lasted 2 years. But yeah, they've been nowhere to be seen, really. And I mean, for my generation, I don't know about you two, but whenever I hear Leyton Orient, I automatically think of this documentary that we're discussing. So I can't think of anything else that they've done. But Ciaran might have a better insight into that. But I suppose he did Barry Hearn did a good job in that he got rid of a man who probably shouldn't have been there in John Sitton, and he stabilised the club that was on the verge of liquidation at the start of this documentary. So, I mean, Sitton took over in the last 2 games of the 1993-94 season with Chris Turner and got 4 points in 2 games, and they stayed up. So it's the following season that they it's a financial meltdown that they go into, and they have 18 senior players in the squad, or 13 at one stage. So they were on the brink of collapse, and Hearn came in and saved them. So from a purely business perspective, it was successful. But they didn't get anywhere near the promised land. And you've already alluded to other teams that were down there with them that we've seen reach the big league, and Orient have been nowhere to be seen. And for someone like me living in Ireland, if I hear the name Leyton Orient, I think of this documentary. Is that a good or bad thing? I don't know. They're certainly memorable to me anyway.
Barry Hearn, you mentioned that he comes in and he gets rid of John Sitton. That ends with the final scene in the documentary where Sitton is sort of emotional, talking to the players. He's saying, I'm out the door, essentially, and he's saying his goodbyes. He thanks the players who he ridiculed throughout the entire documentary. He's now a black taxi driver in London, as you mentioned, and he went through a horrific spout of depression. John Sitton actually has a UEFA A licence, which is it's surprising enough when you look at his sort of managerial approach. You think they would have probably knocked that out of him at one stage or another. But there's a great story about him meeting Jose Mourinho in a black taxi, and I'll just read out some of the quotes. So he got Jose Mourinho, picked him up by accident, and he said, I looked at him and said, what are the chances of that? He smiled because he thought he was just another black taxi driver, surprised that Jose Mourinho had gotten his cab. And he said, no, I'm not surprised because it's you. I'm surprised because what are the chances of getting a Chelsea manager in a cab driven by an ex-Chelsea player? And that really stood out for me, because that really shows you the difference in English football now and English football back then. And sometimes we complain about the financial side of things when it comes to the Premier League and how it's become too much and how it's become too commercial. But when it comes to player wages and player welfare and life after football, this is where the Premier League benefits, because you have players now earning probably too much money, but enough money that they deserve, and they can retire when they're 35 when they have to. And John Sitton is the opposite of that. He has to now work for the rest of his life, having already given up so much between his 20s and his 30s, and then being a manager of a lower league club. He was sort of cast out, and that's probably where football benefits now.
Yeah, he was unfortunate. You know, so much of life is down to timing, and he was the victim of the cruel part of timing, because he had a long and distinguished playing career. Started, as you say, with Chelsea, And he played with Millwall, Gillingham and Leyton Orient, of course, and he's a bit of a club legend. I think he captained one of their promotions. So, and when he was caretaker charge for the 2 games at the back end of the 93-94 season, Tony Wood canvassed the players' opinion about who should take charge for the next season, and they backed Sitton because they liked him. So that's the side we didn't see in the documentary. We only see his unravelling. So I don't think he's by any means this completely unstable lunatic that people probably assume he is from just watching the few clips on YouTube. He was a man at the end of his tether who felt very hard done by, and who felt that he had an imbalance in his working life. And he alluded to that. He said his family were suffering because he was multitasking and massively underpaid. And that is relatable. I mean, everyone can relate to that at some point in their life. But he let it all hang out there. And then the powers that be obviously saw this documentary that aired in October 1995 on Channel 4. This was at a time when television had people's attention. There was nobody on social media, nobody looking down on phones. People were looking at this television screen, and everybody came to the consensus that this guy is out of control. We cannot hire this guy. And as you say, this is in the mid-1990s in the lower leagues. He would have earned nowhere near enough money to take a few years out. And I think he was relieved of his duties halfway through 1995. And by the end of the year, he was on unemployment benefits, couldn't get a job, and applied, I think, for a youth coaching role at Charlton Athletic and was rejected. And they cited the documentary as a result. He briefly became a scout at Manchester City under Joe Royle, long before the Abu Dhabi money, but left that role. And he was a guy who was just left with his thoughts for the next 25 years about what had transpired earlier. And that's incredibly unfair. Nobody deserves to carry that with them. When essentially, when it comes down to it, John Sitton tried his best, but it did not go well in spectacular fashion. And people have held that against him. And maybe it's because he's so brash in the documentary and decides to almost play this character. He alludes to the fact that he was reading Bobby Robson's book, and he quoted Robson saying, I'm not in football to make friends. Well, Robson was probably one of the most popular managers of the last 30 years. So I don't know what, he was channeling the wrong parts of people, and he thought he had to be this authoritarian. And what I say goes. Because he was probably scared. He didn't know what to do himself, and that was his automatic response. And reading about him nowadays, there was an extensive interview he conducted, which you've alluded that he quoted from it, about, I think in 2016, that there's still a bit of that to him, but he's almost playing this character because we do see the softer parts of him in that documentary with his son, and at times when he's talking to other staff in Leyton Orient. So the guy has redeeming features. But he is a victim of people's judgment because he is not seen as a balanced character. And as a result, this is the life he leads now. And he's become this cult hero who has, I think, over 12,000 followers on Twitter. And he just spouts his opinions on life in general, far outside sport. And that's what he's built for himself. But he probably doesn't have the money to back the fame. And that itself is incredibly sad. No?
Yeah, listen, it depends where you fall on it. It could be, you can look at it one way. You can look that he was a little bit loose when he was younger, that he might have learned from his mistakes, and that he does deserve a second chance. And I buy into that to an extent. But if you look at any manager nowadays, we think that Jose Mourinho was harsh on players. Imagine what people would think of John Sitton now if he was managing players at this stage with that same attitude towards them. It wouldn't work, first of all, with modern players. I don't think it ever worked really to a great degree. That sort of management style only works to a certain degree. It eventually wears thin and players stop reacting to you. And really and truly, there are only about 2 to 3 players in a dressing room of 16, 17 that will react in a good way to being absolutely slated by their manager. Colm, this is, as you say, it's a cult documentary. It's one that was recorded out of the blue by a fan. The grainy footage adds to it. It's a fly-in-the-wall documentary. Where does this rank amongst your football documentaries, and can you throw your suggestion into the hat for next week?
Oh, you've put me on the spot there with the latter question, but it's quite high. It's top 5 football documentaries. I didn't enjoy it as much as An Impossible Job, the Graham Taylor documentary, and I didn't enjoy it as my favourite mockumentary in Mike Bassett, England Manager, but it would be in and around there. No shame that it comes third to those two, but I really enjoyed it. You would never see something like that nowadays. And if you do, we might see it in the Spurs documentary and the Amazon documentary coming up. I think you'll see a more nuanced version. And the one thing that Sitton lacked was nuance. As for the next documentary, maybe the two Escobars, the 30 for 30 series, fantastic documentary. I don't know if you've heard of that.
I've seen it. It's definitely worth watching. And if you want to listen back or watch back any of our shows from previous that we looked at Mike Bassett and we looked at The Impossible Job and a ton of other stuff from a couple of weeks ago, you can find us as part of the OTB Podcast Network on offtheball.com or in the OTB Sports app, which is available to download now wherever you get your apps. And over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at football documentaries. Like you said, two Escobars is worth it. We will be covering Bobby Robson's documentary as well, because I do think that's one of the best sports documentaries ever made, never mind just football. But that's all we have time for tonight. Colm, thanks for joining us, and to Ciaran Bradley as well, who dropped off the Skype line a little bit earlier on.